Hey, this is Shanshan. I'm the artist behind shanshan.co and I do specials on eBay. Today I'm going to review Bad Times at Royale. So this is called Bad Times at Royale. It's at a hotel that's based up in Tahoe, and it's right on the state line between California and Nevada. So half the hotel you have gambling, one side is a little more expensive, so a little bit of quirkiness to the hotel, which kind of plays out in the plot. It's more kind of a gimmick to pull you in. I think from a marketing standpoint, I think you could have done a little bit more with what actually happens on the Nevada versus California side. In the story itself, it might have made a little more sense, but it's kind of a fun concept. So what happens at the hotel, all these characters kind of show up at the hotel for all different reasons. There's a traveling salesman who isn't who he really says he is. There's a priest who isn't really who he says he is. There's a pissed off woman who shows up who isn't who she appears to be. There's a singer who shows up whose story basically is what it is. And at the end you have some plot twists that bring out other characters like Billy Lee, who's a cult leader. So those are kind of your core characters. There are some other characters that come along, like the gang surrounding Billy Lee, which is in the third act. But at the beginning, it's just kind of all these characters show up at the hotel randomly. It's interesting in the aspect that none of the characters say who they say they are, and they all have kind of a weird backstory that plays out after certain things happen in the film. So the film's kind of cut up like a Pulp Fiction, that they cut it by room basically. So this room, this person's vision, what's their backstory? This room, this person's backstory, and then back and forth. And it generally works out. Sometimes it gets a little clunky, maybe towards the end as they're kind of doing the final act. They kind of punch out and then come back, and so the flashback is a little bit unnecessary at that point. But all in, it's kind of interesting to see how all these elements come together. I really liked all the characters that had this kind of strange backstory. You really don't know who they are. Like, one of the most interesting characters I thought was Emily Summerspring. She comes in as this crazed woman, and then it turns out she has a kidnapped person with her, and it's like, oh my god, what is this? And later it turns out her sister, and she's freeing her from this cult. So it's totally crazy. So it's like, it goes from like pissed off woman to like villain, and then victim, and then hero kind of at the end. And you're like, what? It has a really good character arc to that story. The same with Father Flynn. He comes in, he pretends to be a priest, but actually turns out he was a bank robber in the past. So it's really interesting there. And some of the surprising scenes that come from the early 60s, they pull together then. And Billy Lee, who's this cult leader, comes in. That's tied into Somerset Springs' story. There's this salesman who's an insurance salesman, but it actually turns out he really isn't who he says he is. He actually works for either the FBI or the CIA, and they've been spying on people, so it's pretty interesting. The hotel boy himself, he runs this rundown hotel. It used to be big, but then the casino side had to close down, so all the big wigs left. It used to be the Rat Pack and everyone would hang out there, but now it's just dead. So, and it's interesting because my dad actually worked in a hotel on Tahoe where they did have the Rat Pack and all those guys show up. So it might have been a similar hotel to where my dad worked. I don't think it was that particular hotel, but who knows? A lot of those hotels closed down. They're not as popular as they once were. And there's all really good backstory for a lot of the characters, which really gives them a lot of meat on the character. And when some of these characters get shot, you're just like, what? So it has a really good suspense in this film, from the very first scene to quite a few scenes where you're rooting for one person, and then all of a sudden they die, and you're like, how could that possibly be possible, right? So it's a really fun suspense movie. One of the stylistic choices they made that's very interesting is there's almost no soundtrack, and so it's cut kind of like a 60s, 70s film in that sense, obviously with the costumes and stuff, but as well, there's not a lot this jangly camera action that it's very typical nowadays, which I think just sucks. And so they don't really play with that. The dialogue could have been better. The characters are really good, but sometimes the dialogue it's not as well written as, say, Tarantino, who this film is kind of copying his style in the sense you have these long scenes. And if you have long scenes, you better have a freaking killer-ass dialogue. So some of the dialogue kind of falls flat. There's also a secret part of the hotel, which they use 2 or 3 times. I don't know if it makes more sense to use it maybe twice. So some of the scenes are kind of repeated from different character standpoint, but it makes more sense probably to use them once and kind of cut the film down a little bit more. But overall, it's fairly interesting, especially with the cult leader. You really see one of the victims, one of the sisters is a real victim. She's actually totally in control by this guy. So it's very interesting, as well as the reaction of Darlene Sweet, who's a singer. She's not intimidated by this cult leader, even though tied and gagged, their lives are on the line. But she's like, I don't care. These guys, he's meaningless, So that's a really interesting concept. Yeah, the camera angles were really nice in this film. There's not a lot of music, a lot of good shots. They ranged a lot of shots where there's close-ups, so you get a lot of detail shots, and then you kind of zoom back to the wide shots. So they play quite a bit with the camera angles. I think basically they should just tighten the dialogue. But again, it feels kind of like a Pulp Fiction mixed in with the Mystery on the Orient Express kind of feel, where you don't know who did it, but the Mystery on the Orient Express ends up like all of them are killers. In this case, you don't know where the story's going. It's going from one story and this changes, and then another story pops up and it changes, and this story comes over here and it changes. And so there's a lot of really fun elements that roll out with the story as you peel back the onion. So it has a really fun element. I don't think you can watch it more than once because, again, you kill the suspense. But man, some of the scenes just like, bam, they kill these people and you're like... So I think they get that really down, the shock value. But yeah, some of the elements could have been tightened, just better, a little bit better dialogue in some of the scenes, and maybe add some music. I mean, they had some music that made sense for the silent part, but other parts you're just like, it just seemed dead to be dead, which I don't know if that made sense. Like they could have used the jukebox more that they have as a kind of a prop in the movie, and it actually becomes like the key music for the background, which is really interesting. That hasn't done too often in film, and the singer also sings as part of the music as well. So it has a lot of different fun scenes that kind of pull together. I might have edited the film a little bit differently, maybe flash forward and then flash back, or yeah, I mean, some of the scenes might have been cut down. I don't know. It's just, it seems like the editing's a little off here and there, but it's really a fun film. It's 2 hours 20 minutes, so that's a little long maybe, but I guess you need to flesh out a lot of the characters. So overall, it's a really fun movie. So hopefully you like my review. Give me a thumbs up. If you want to subscribe below, and hope to see you in the next video. Thanks, guys.